Gypsy Rose was recently released from prison and within weeks released her memoir titled Released: Conversations on the Eve of Freedom, where she dropped huge bombshells you may have never heard before. One of the biggest revelations was that Gypsy would actually take baths with Dee Dee, up until the day Dee Dee passed away. If you thought Gypsy's relationship with her mother was crazy, it somehow gets crazier than that apparently. Gypsy actually shares how she never thought that this wasn't normal, and in the bath is where her mother would assist Gypsy and help her shave her hair, and when I say hair, yes I do mean everywhere, and Dee Dee would refer to this as making Gypsy clean. During a recorded interrogation following the arrest, Nicholas Gaujon, who was Gypsy's boyfriend at the time, who I should also mention actually went through the plan alongside her, he, during interrogation, actually said that after he did the unthinkable act to Dee Dee, Gypsy went to the bathroom and shaved her hairs herself. Plus, Gypsy hid in the bathroom the whole time anyways. He slowly and painfully took her mother's life. After Dee Dee was without a pulse, that's when Nick allegedly wanted to do disgusting things to Dee Dee, but Gypsy didn't let him, and instead Nick did these actions to Gypsy, and he claimed it's consensual. Gypsy says it's not. It's a whole big thing. It's also important to mention Gypsy was 23 years old when the attack happened, and her mom would literally bathe with her up until then. Before we move on to the next revelation, I wanted you to know this next one may be sensitive for some viewers, so keep that in mind. In both the docuseries and Gypsy's book, she alleges that her own grandfather would essay both her and her own mother. Gypsy said that her grandfather would essay her mother even when she was an adult, and while Dee Dee was recovering from a car accident, this is when Gypsy said her grandfather would carry Dee Dee into the rooms, and that's when this act allegedly would take place. That's how she found out it was happening. But in the docuseries, her grandfather actually speaks about these allegations. His name's Claude, and he is the father of Dee Dee. He denied ever harming Gypsy Rose or her mother, and instead claimed she was the one that tried to touch him. Okay, Claude said she was the one that was trying to touch me, and I said no, don't do that. Gypsy also shared she hasn't communicated or spoken to him since she was a child. Honestly, it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, these are very serious allegations, so I don't really want to speculate on it too much, but what do you think about the whole Claude versus Gypsy story? Clearly some acknowledgement was made, but I don't really know. I just hope if this is true, then some healing goes on Gypsy's behalf. And as of Claude getting help he needs maybe as well, because even Gypsy said it herself, she wanted to share this story to hopefully prevent anyone else from becoming a victim of his. But I don't want to speculate too much as said, so pitter patter, let's get at her. Now for something a little more light to cover, Gypsy was actually baptized 7 times. Not for any reason though, just because Dee Dee told everyone she was gonna grow up and become a nun. She was raised Roman Catholic in Louisiana, but eventually Dee Dee became non-denominational when they moved to Missouri. Gypsy recounted how she was baptized 5 times before her mother's life was taken, and then another 2 times when she got to the county prison, and then when she got to the correctional center, as she never felt clean. Gypsy even once said she thought she was gonna be a nun one day as well, so she made a little altar in her bedroom and placed little statues that were sold at her Bible gift shop. As a kid, she would align all her stuffed animals and her cat as they would pretend to attend church, as Gypsy led them all in prayer and gave out communion by feeding them crackers and grape juice to all of her stuffies and cats. And then fast forward to 2024, she's not a nun, but she's a so-called influencer and reformed killer, so I mean that took a turn. I mean nobody could have predicted that happening to their life in 2015 or ever, so alright. Another bombshell revealed in Gypsy's book was that Dee Dee and her would allegedly shoplift by using the wheelchair. This actually I feel like I could have guessed. This feels really predictable honestly, just suits the whole narrative. When they were shopping, they would use the wheelchair to knock items off the shelves, and then when they picked them up, they'd simply just under the princess dress. And at the time, Dee Dee told everyone Gypsy was 5 years younger than her real age, and even dressed her in children's clothes. And once they had the items hidden, then they just swapped the barcodes on the expensive stuff with the cheaper ones. In fact, Gypsy can't even recall how many items they stole. She described her mom as a hoarder, and according to her, their bedroom floor had so much piled on it, she needed to carve a pathway for herself from the door to the bed. And what makes this situation unfortunate, as if it wasn't already, was that the community has viewed this mother and daughter as a kind mother-daughter duo, taking care of her sick special needs child, which ultimately caused no one to suspect they were stealing. It also made it easier for the two, as they would go to the self-checkout lane so no employee was there to notice the low prices for the expensive items. Grab a PS4, put it in as some grapes. That kind of logic. In her book, she talked about how her mother would claim to be a powerful witch, which actually doesn't line up with the non-denominational thing, but okay. Apparently this powerful powerful witch Dee Dee would use spells to punish her own daughter. Dee Dee would continue to tell Gypsy that she saw shapes and shadows as well as heard voices from people who disliked Gypsy. And Gypsy herself said that her mother had suffered from schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, but it's ultimately unclear what Dee Dee was diagnosed with, if anything at all. So, while Gypsy's in prison, she actually explored her mother's footsteps as she began to look into Wicca, as it felt familiar to her, and she grew up near New Orleans. Back in 2011, Gypsy tried to run from home after meeting a man named Dan at a convention, and when her mom found out and took her home, she tied her to the bed for 2 weeks and even put a voodoo hex on her. According to Gypsy, Dee Dee printed out a picture of Dan and a picture of Gypsy, then she placed the photos in a mason jar alongside a cow tongue and even a little bit of Gypsy's time of the month, if you know what I mean. Dee Dee then took the jar and buried it in the backyard and then told Gypsy she'd never find love or be happy. To this day, Gypsy literally believes that the hex that her mother put on her could be true because every time she gets close to someone, they leave her. But I feel like there's another reason for that. I'm assuming most of you know that Gypsy was isolated for much of her life. Her mother didn't seem to want to let anyone get too close with her daughter because of the risks of her secrets being revealed. As Gypsy grew up, she was homeschooled, at least for a bit, because shortly after, Dee Dee just stopped educating her daughter and it was never really challenged by the authorities. She was friends with a few neighbors' kids, but she wasn't allowed to get too close to them, as Dee Dee always made sure that she was Gypsy's closest support system. So when she was sent to prison, Gypsy actually only had a first grade education. That is actually insane. But in prison, she was actually able to attend school and eventually earned herself the equivalent of a high school diploma. Did you know that Gypsy also had to write a letter to her own mother as an exercise for a mandatory prison class, which discussed the impacts of crimes on victims? She wrote, "With now having the answers I sought to find, I'm able to finally let go of the resentment I had against you and forgive you." She also apologizes for having a part in her passing and wrote about how she doesn't go a single day without thinking about her mom as she carries her regret and remorse for the rest of her life. In another part of the letter, Gypsy also wrote, "I will always love you for bringing me into this world and will remember you with love for the woman I know was a good person behind the mental disorder." And this was because Dee Dee's believed to have also suffered the things she put Gypsy through. Now that Gypsy's been released, she's been using her social media platforms as a way to hopefully spread awareness about what she's been through, to help others in similar situations find an alternative way out than what she did. Did you know Gypsy spent 2 weeks in solitary confinement? And this was after a stranger posted something onto social media, and the prison officials interpreted this post as a signal that Gypsy was planning on escaping. That's when she was moved to solitary confinement while they investigated. Gypsy has called this time traumatizing, and it didn't make sense to her. This also happened just a few months before her parole hearing. When you're in solitary confinement, you're like physically isolated from basically everyone. On average, you spend 22 to 24 hours a day in your cell. In 2015, the United Nations actually adapted a rule to prohibit placements in solitary confinement beyond 15 straight days, which is already way too much. There are numerous studies done that documented the harmful psychological effects of long-term solitary confinement, which even included visual and auditory hallucinations. So as the story of Gypsy Rose unfolded, more and more secrets were finally exposed, and that included Gypsy's fake illnesses. Since Gypsy was a few months old, Dee Dee started to tell her father Rod that Gypsy had multiple illnesses, and this only escalated as time went on. Gypsy was known for being a strong child who battled a ton of illnesses. Physically, she looked like a child battling cancer, as Dee Dee had shaved her head. She was also in a wheelchair, she had a feeding tube, and it would be quite believable to think that Gypsy was truly ill because of it. But Gypsy actually believed she was sick too, and the only thing she knew, she actually didn't need to use her wheelchair. And that's because before doctor appointments, Dee Dee would instruct Gypsy to sit in the wheelchair and not move her legs, and she did what she was told since she was a child, and she knew what would happen if she didn't listen to her mom. Plus, Dee Dee even once applied a numbing gel on the inside of Gypsy's mouth before an appointment to prove to doctors that she was experiencing excessive drooling, and ultimately the doctors went through with a surgical procedure to remove her saliva glands. But it wasn't until after her arrest she found out everything else, including her cancer diagnosis, were all fake. Dee Dee was actually able to lead doctors into believing what she said, and this all escalated after Hurricane Katrina wiped out many medical records, so it's easier to fake Gypsy's past. It's crazy to me that Gypsy lived most of her life believing she was very sick, and it took her being literally arrested for killing her mom to know the truth about her own health. herself. I'm assuming most of you know about her relationship with Nick. As aforementioned, Nicholas Gaujon. The two met online and eventually planned and acted on taking Dee Dee's life. But you know the two continued to date even after they were both sent to prison? While they were in county jail, they would exchange letters by hiding them in the recreation room and also writing love messages on the walls. So when they moved to prison, they did break up, but then exchanged letters still. And when Nick found out she was engaged to Ken, who was her ex before her current husband, Ryan Anderson, aka Peter Griffin, he actually accused Gypsy of cheating because they were still married under God's law. So Gypsy replied to this message and told Nick that she had never wanted to get back with him, but she did feel a sense of guilt, which is why she decided to testify on his behalf at the trial. That is where he was sentenced to life without parole, and she accepted a plea deal. Plus, Gypsy sent Nick a closure letter after he was sentenced to life in prison. She felt guilty for him because she believes if he hadn't met her, he wouldn't have done what he did. In fact, Gypsy couldn't get it out of her head that Nick was looking at going to prison for the rest of his life because she didn't even realize she had also faced the same possible fate. According to Gypsy, it just didn't dawn on her that she was in as deep a trouble as he was, which is a little questionable for people like you and I, but we have to remember she only received up to a first grade level of education, had very little knowledge of the court system. And that is 10 bombshells Gypsy Rose Blanchard revealed in her book. What shocked you the most? And are you planning on reading her book or even watching her series on Lifetime? I'd love to know all your thoughts down below, and if you made it this far, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you another time. Bye.